Good day everyone. For this particular video, we will be discussing on how to write creatively. Specifically, we will focus on drawing inspiration from experiences and of course, using imagery. Now, in addressing the question how to write creatively, it is worth noting, students, that being a creative writer is not something that we can be good at from the start. However, it is something that we can improve continuously once we become familiar with it. With that being said, it gives us this particular challenge. How do we start? Now, one possible tip that we could use whenever we want to start writing is to read. When we say we read to write, it means reading various forms of literary works such as poems, novels, short stories, etc. This allows us to become familiar with the different writing styles of other writers. Now, reading also gives us an idea on what to write and how to write our own literary pieces. Whenever we read the literary works of others, we get an idea regarding the literary forms or literary styles that they use. In doing so, we are also able to discover our own styles as well as have an inspiration or idea regarding what particular topic or what particular story we can write about. Another tip for aspiring creative writers is to conduct research. Now, when we conduct research, remember that we always learn something new. Same thing in writing. Aside from reading literary pieces of other writers, doing research allows us to become familiar with various themes and ideas that we can use for writing our stories. By conducting research, we are able to give accurate information regarding certain details or certain information about characters, about events that we are going to include in our stories. Of course, aside from reading other literary pieces to give us an idea or an inspiration regarding how to write, as well as conducting research to give us additional information about the concepts or themes that we are going to write about, it is very much important to practice writing. Once we get an idea on what to write and how to write, one way to improve our creative writing skills is to practice. Practicing allows us to polish our writing skills through recognizing possible mistakes and making necessary revisions to improve our literary pieces. Remember that no writer is born a good writer. He always undergoes multiple stages of practices. It is one way of helping writers to further improve. It is one way of helping writers to know how they can improve in terms of their writing styles, in terms of their writing skills, and of course in terms of improving their content. Next one is to draw from experience. When we say drawing from experience, this means that we are writing stories which are inspired by our personal experiences. We have to remember that our experiences are the best source material when writing a story, as we are able to recall the details and events and explain them clearly. Now, Furthermore, when writing from experience, we must bear in mind the following. What are meaningful details in the story? Next, how can I describe these events effectively? And how do these events unfold in my story? Let's try to dig deeper into these particular details. In answering the question, what are the meaningful details in the story? Of course, this focuses on answering the questions who, what, when, where, how, and why. Pretty much the basic details in a story. Now, recognizing these information allows us to write literature with clearer details. A creative writer is not only able to write a story just for the sake of writing it, rather, a creative writer is able to write a story that is able to enhance or entice the imagination of the readers through careful and meaningful description of different details. Next question, how can I describe these events effectively? This means that it is necessary to be able to describe these events clearly. Now, creative writers make use of imagery and figurative language to make descriptions of these events. We'll talk about figurative language and imagery a little bit later. And lastly, we have the question, how do these events unfold in my story? Now, part of writing an effective story is being able to narrate how each event unfolds. Writers should recognize the importance of following the plot in order to make sure that the story is logical. As such, creative writers make use of various transition devices to ensure that the events follow a logical sequence. When we say logical sequence, it means that each event is connected with each other. Each event leads to another event, which in turn would make the story more interesting and more meaningful for the readers. Now, at this point, we talk about use of imagery. Now, one way to make clear and vivid descriptions of events in a story is through the effective use of imagery. Imagery, in its most basic description, is vivid descriptive language that appeals to one or more of the senses. This could refer to the sense of sight, sense of hearing, sense of touch, smell, and sense of taste. However, in terms of the types of imagery, we actually have 7. We have visual imagery, auditory imagery, olfactory imagery, gustatory imagery, tactile imagery, kinesthetic imagery, and organic imagery. Let's talk about each one separately. Now, the first type of imagery is visual imagery. Visual imagery, from the word itself, appeals to the sense of sight and plays the largest role in imagery in literature, simply because it describes what a scene or a character looks like. We have to remember that when writing a story, it is important that we as writers are able to vividly describe how a certain scene looks like or how a certain character would look like. That way, we are able to paint a picture into the minds of our readers regarding what kind of image we want them to see. Let's look at this example here. A young woman in her early teens, Daenerys has a classical Valyrian look. She has violet eyes, pale skin, and long pale silver gold hair. Daenerys is slender of frame with small breasts. She's said to resemble Queen Daenerys Targaryen, though Daenerys is taller. Daenerys has been described as fair and beautiful. If we are going to observe, we have all these words or all these adjectives that would describe how a person would physically look like, such as violet eyes, pale skin, long pale silver gold hair, slender, fair, and beautiful. So all these words or all these adjectives are examples of visual imagery because they give the readers an idea of how a certain character, for this instance Daenerys Targaryen, would look like. The next type of imagery is auditory imagery. Auditory imagery describes specific sounds that are happening within the story. Auditory imagery could also appear in the form of onomatopoeia. Remember that in auditory imagery, we are not able to hear, or the readers are not able to actually hear what is going on in the story. Rather, we are able to let them hear or recognize a particular sound through the use of our words. Let's look at this example here from Robert Frost. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So we have the words sound, of course, and the sweep of easy wind. Now, we do not actually hear what an easy wind would sound like, but it gives us an idea that aside from the bells, there is the existence of other sounds, which is the wind. It all depends on how we are able to associate what the sound of a wind would be. The next type of imagery is olfactory imagery. Olfactory imagery describes a particular scent. Now, similar with auditory imagery, wherein the writer is able to use words that will allow the readers to hear what a particular scene would sound like, in olfactory imagery, authors want the readers to be able to almost smell the scent coming off the pages. Again, this is through the effective use of words, descriptive words, that would let the readers be able to have an idea of how a particular event, how a particular instance, or how a particular scent smells like. Let's look at this example here. It was a beautiful Saturday morning. Dave woke up to the warm, inviting aroma of brewed coffee. As he slowly went downstairs, he caught a whiff of deep-fried crispy bacon and garlic rice. From that moment, he knew that this would be a good morning. If we're going to analyze, we have these words here such as the aroma of brewed coffee, a whiff of deep-fried crispy bacon, and garlic rice. From these particular words, we are able to associate these descriptions to the actual smell of these particular items or these particular food items. Next, we have kinesthetic imagery. Kinesthetic imagery deals with the movement or action of objects or people. It actually gives a vivid description of how certain characters move or act in a story. Kinesthetic imagery gives the readers an idea of how certain characters move, what kind of movement are they making, and how are they going to move about in certain situations. Let's look at this example here. He had nowhere else to go. As he hid by the corner, he could feel his heart pounding with fear and tension. He knows that one wrong step would put him in trouble. He looked around and slowly crept towards the nearest warehouse to seek refuge. Now, we have these words here such as pounding, looked, and crept. These words indicate how a certain character is acting regarding a certain situation. While pounding itself is not the movement, rather it is more of how the heart moves in his heart, signaling that he is actually filled with terror, with fear and tension. Of course, the word crept is the motion or the action of the character when he tries to slowly creep away from where he is standing in order to look for the nearest place to seek refuge. Next, we have tactile imagery. Tactile imagery is a type of imagery that deals with our sense of touch. In tactile imagery, through the effective use of descriptive words, the writers are able to let the readers feel certain situations in a story. For example, this statement here. As I tumbled down the hill, the loose rocks raced alongside me, pricking my hands and face like 100 tiny knives. Now, even though we are not in the actual situation, we are able to feel how the certain character is feeling at that particular moment because of the words pricking and like 100 tiny knives, meaning that it is not something that is comfortable. It is something that is painful and irritating. The next type of imagery is gustatory imagery. Gustatory imagery deals with our sense of taste. This type of imagery allows writers to clearly describe to readers how certain food or items would taste like. For example, the familiar comforting warmth of the chicken noodle soup with the moist chicken and soft carrots instantly made Mike feel much better. Now, we are able to recognize that the chicken noodle soup is something that would make the person, whoever eats it, feel better because of, again, the words that we use. We have moist chicken and soft carrots, meaning that the food is not only well prepared, but it is something that would make you feel good when you eat it. And lastly, we have the organic type of imagery. The organic imagery is the most difficult form of imagery to write, mainly because it deals with creating a specific feeling or emotion within the reader. In organic imagery, phrases that make the reader feel sad, fearful, nostalgic, elated, or even lost are all extremely effective organic imagery. In organic imagery, we are able to play with words that would enable our readers to feel a certain way. We are able to make our readers empathize with the characters that we have in the story. Let's look at this example here. She's not coming back. As Jonah heard those words, his hands tightened into fists, his eyes filled with tears. He wanted to punch the walls and scream until his lungs burst, but to no avail. He was left there, staring into nothingness, with nothing but the feeling of guilt and anger altogether. Now we have these examples here, such as his hands tightened into fists, which suggest, of course, the feeling of rage, of anger, of extreme hatred. And of course, this expression, his eyes filled with tears, which would signal that the character is currently feeling emotional. The character is feeling sad. The character is feeling lonely. With the use of these words, we are able to explain that Jonah, the character in this particular situation, is feeling guilty, feeling sad, and at the same time feeling angry because of what had happened. In a nutshell, learning how to write creatively is never an easy task. It requires enough exposure to other literary forms to help aspiring writers have an idea on how to write. However, with constant practice and proper application of different writing techniques, aspiring writers are able to come up with effective and meaningful literary pieces.